there, silly geese. What'd you bring us this time, Quackers? Ooh, this is a good one. You might have seen this theory floating around, that Katniss is neurodivergent. Usually it's said as a fun headcanon, but what if it's the key to understanding why people, both in Panem and out here in the real world, have trouble understanding her? What does neurodivergent mean? If you're chronically online, like this ducker over here, then you probably have seen this term before, but do you really know what it means? It's often used as a sort of shorthand for ADHD and or autism, but it's really more inclusive than that. According to Merriam-Webster, neurodivergent means having or relating to a condition that impacts the way the brain processes information or develops. This includes autism and ADHD, yes, but it also includes OCD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's syndrome, auditory processing disorder, learning disabilities, mental health conditions, and even acquired neurodivergence like PTSD. And while I'm not a doctor, I think that the text actually gives us plenty of conclusive evidence to support that Katniss is in fact neurodivergent. Specifically, it looks like she has complex PTSD. Again, we're not diagnosing her. We're reading how trauma shapes her behavior, her perception, and the relationships within the story. That's all. What is complex PTSD? Complex PTSD develops through prolonged trauma. Think repeated abuse, neglect, or environments that never feel safe. It's often described in 3 clusters: affect regulation, emotional reactivity, self-destructiveness, dissociation. Self-concept, feelings of worthlessness, shame, guilt.
Yeah, but I'm not very good at making friends.
Relationships, deep difficulty with trust or sustained emotional intimacy.
So what happens when we get back?
I don't know. I guess we try to forget.
Those definitely don't sound like any of the qualities we've heard about, right? When people think about Katniss and PTSD, it's natural to think about the games. But Katniss had PTSD long before the games, actually, around 5 years before the games. Katniss grows up in a loving home until her father dies in a mine explosion. And her mother goes catatonic. I'm not assigning moral blame to Katniss's mom for her grief. I just want us to look at how Katniss describes this period. My father had been killed in the mine accident 3 months earlier in the bitterest January anyone could remember. At the time, all I knew was that I had lost not only a father, but a mother as well. At 11 years old, with Prim just 7, I took over as head of the family. My mother didn't do anything but sit propped up in a chair, eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Katniss becomes head of the household, not emotionally, but for survival. Katniss had no choice but to step up. Can you imagine how that would affect you if you were 11? Taking on so much responsibility? If it had become known that my mother could no longer care for us, the district would have taken us away and placed us in the community home. I could never let that happen to Prim. So, I kept her predicament a secret. But the money ran out, and we were slowly starving to death. There's no other way to put it. Katniss simply states this as fact, but what she's saying here is devastating. An 11-year-old keeping her family alive, alone, 4 months, unable to ask for support without maybe putting her and her sister into foster care, essentially. That's not just survival, that's trauma. I couldn't go home, because at home was my mother with her dead eyes and my little sister with her hollow cheeks and cracked lips. I couldn't walk into that room with the smoky fire from the damp branches I had scavenged at the edge of the woods after the coal had run out. My hands empty of any hope. That's a child describing despair, carrying a burden she shouldn't have had to take on alone. And this isn't happening in isolation. District 12 itself is the site of chronic, normalized trauma. Starvation's not an uncommon fate in District 12. Who hasn't seen the victims? Older people who can't work, children from a family with too many to feed, those injured in the mines, straggling through the streets, and one day, you come upon them, sitting motionless against a wall or lying in the meadow. You can hear the wails from a house, and the peacekeepers are called in to retrieve the body. Starvation is never the cause of death, officially. When your world exposes you to that much trauma and treats it as routine, that shapes your brain, your body, and your sense of safety. Seeing Katniss's trauma. Even if we only look at the first book, Katniss shows clear signs of complex trauma. Nightmares. 5 years later, I still wake up screaming for him to run. Low self-worth. I don't think of District 12 as a place that cares about me. Emotional reactivity, like when she pushes Peeta to the ground after his confession, or the sudden anger that we see towards Haymitch and or Effie. Dissociation. There are the obvious examples, like how she can't seem to remember anyone's names, and the occasions where she flattens her narration when she's feeling overwhelmed. But there's another, maybe more interesting example. Do you remember that iconic moment where Katniss is blowing kisses out into the crowd and smiling and giggling in the opening ceremony? That's not confidence. It's probably dissociation. It's the same nervous system that once shut down to keep her alive in District 12, now doing what it must to survive the Capitol, creating a temporary self that can be adored, while the real one hides somewhere safer. It's just a trauma response that happens to photograph and film well. And we see Katniss struggle to trust Peeta. We see how she freezes anytime someone shows her kindness. And we also see how she keeps most, if not all, of her relationships transactional, including the one with Gale. There's another trait that's associated with complex PTSD that is often overlooked in this conversation, and that is heightened empathy. A 2018 study by Greenberg et al. In Frontiers in Psychology found that survivors of childhood trauma often show higher levels of empathy. That might explain what Joanna calls her defender of the helpless act. Katniss isn't performing compassion, she's flooded by it. It's the same reason she frequently risks herself for others and can't explain why. She feels it in her body before she even has the words for it. Why does this matter? Even though we know that people experience the world differently, we still assume neurotypical behavior is the default and expect anyone who deviates from that model to perform normalcy in order to earn understanding. In Katniss's case, we are told exactly what shaped her, but people still call her cold, difficult, or ungrateful. We do this in real life too. We expect people to smile through pain, make eye contact, and modulate their tone before we start taking their suffering seriously. When Effie's preparing Katniss for the interview, like this, I'm smiling at you even though you're aggravating me. She's teaching her to be safe through performance. When Haymitch pushes her to be more likable, when you open your mouth, you come across as sullen and hostile. If you won't talk about yourself, at least compliment the audience. He's really helping her navigate a system that punishes honesty. But Katniss's empathy isn't the kind that performs in that kind of situation well. She feeds people when they're hungry, not because it looks good. She volunteers for Prim because she can't not volunteer for her. And we see this for practically everyone she decides to become allies with in Catching Fire.
At least half the tributes want you as an ally.
I want Wyrus and Beatty.
Joanna calls them nuts and bolts.
Well, okay, good. Now, who else?
Mags.
But we're not talking about that. In Panem, and especially the games, survival depends on a good performance. And let's be honest, so does acceptance in the real world. To get help, to get care, to be believed, you often have to act like you're fine. And Katniss's story is an opportunity to remember that some people can't, and that doesn't make them broken. So, back to the take. Katniss is neurodivergent. I think this one is probably true. There's a clear inciting incident, and many of the traits that Katniss is known for look suspiciously similar to the symptoms of complex PTSD. Quick note here, usually when people make this claim, they are saying that Katniss is likely autistic. And that interpretation is valid. I focused on complex PTSD because there's a lot of textual support for this interpretation, and the symptoms for complex PTSD and autism often overlap, so it's hard to say one way or the other. They often coexist. Survival in the real world and in Panem require us to learn to play the game, But if we actually cared, we would give up the games altogether. But what do I know? I'm just a silly goose. Quackers?